name's Susannah Fullerton. I'm the president of the Jane Austen Society of Australia. I have written about Jane Austen, talked about Jane Austen, and been a Jane Austen addict for much of my life. With me is my dear friend, Dr Ruth Wilson, author of the fabulous new book, The Jane Austen Remedy, and also a Jane Austen addict for all of her life. We're here today to talk about the new Netflix version of Persuasion, which has been getting a lot of publicity in the newspapers and in social media. It came out just this year and it stars Dakota Johnson in the role of Anne Elliot. Persuasion is one of the best loved books of all time. Wonderfully romantic, superbly written, deep, meaningful, and a complex novel. We're both very aware that transferring a novel to the screen inevitably means changes, and of course some parts of the novel are not going to be included in a movie. But this new Netflix Persuasion has got a lot in it that is not new. So Ruth, what do you expect when a much-loved novel is turned into a film? How accurate do you want it to be?
Well, Susannah, because my very first experience of a screen adaptation was one back in the 1940s, that very famous one with Greer Garson and Laurence Olivier, I started off thinking I wanted it to be as close to the novel in terms of the representation of the characters and also somehow the dialogue, the language. I wanted that as well. And I think because I had so much loved Greer Garson and her speaking of the lines, I heard Lizzie Bennet. I really wanted them to be, these adaptations, to be as close to the text that was on the page as they could be. Over the years, I became a little less severe in that. I have to say that the one that really shocked me was Clueless. That's one I have never learned to like. I've watched it many times. But I think that's because I realised that what was important to me was that the spirit of Jane Austen and the novel she had written needed somehow to be embodied in the language of film. I know that every film adaptation is going to be a reinterpretation, a reconsideration, but I do want it to be true to the spirit and what I really want it to carry, and that's what I missed in Clueless, and I know that that was perhaps an appropriation even rather than an adaptation. I just couldn't see the moral seriousness there. I didn't feel the dark underneath the lightness that is what I really want to feel, and I don't feel it in the new Persuasion either.
I think I'm fonder of Clueless than you are because I feel it's one of the few Jane Austen film adaptations which manages to keep the irony of the novel, and it does that through the voiceover technique. But I agree that when you touch a great novel and you pick it up and turn it into a film version, you do have to capture the spirit of the novel. And I agree that this new Netflix Persuasion really fails to do that. I think for me also what's really important is that it gets the historical accuracy of the period. So when you get a lot of details where clothing is wrong or hair is wrong or the dialogue is something that would never have been uttered in the early 19th century, it grates and it creates a sense of distance that you just don't really feel you're in a Jane Austen era. And for me, that was also a major fault of the new Persuasion. There were so many details. Anne going swimming in the ocean when a young lady of that era would never have learned to swim. Hair that was down instead of up. Language about exes and rating somebody as 10 out of 10 and things that were terribly 20th or 21st century. And for me, they just caused so many distractions from the story and from the dialogue, which also I needed to be distracted from, that there were just too many problems in the film. So what did you admire about the new... Let's start off on a positive note here, Ruth. What did you admire about the new Netflix Persuasion?
Right, Susannah, I must say when we talked about discussing this film, I wanted to say, first of all, I am in two minds about it, and I want to talk about those two minds a little bit. So the first one that I do like is that I found it actually very entertaining. I'll go into what I didn't find entertaining or didn't like in its entertainingness later. I thought the scenes with the Musgrove sisters were absolutely delightful, particularly in the beginning, their joy in meeting with Anne, which is sort of hinted at, but in a much gentler way in the film itself. I also loved the social satire. I thought the camping up of Sir Walter, which really I thought was in a direct line with the camping up of Mr. Woodhouse in the more recent Emma. That one did work for me. It took a while with Emma. I think Emma sort of softened me up. And I love Richard Grant. I really think he is very, very funny. So they were the things that worked for me. What didn't work for me was presenting Anne Elliot at times as a buffoon. And I really think, Jane Austen has a special place for buffoons, and she has a special skill with buffoonery, and she certainly did that with Sir Walter and Elizabeth and the esteemed noble relative. She did that social satire was wonderful. But I think, if I can return to something you said, what this film really lacks, I think, is any irony. It is so heavy-handed. And that breaking of the fourth wall, which they all talk about in the film, yes, I get it, that's film language, and I thought at first that might work as a film language for free indirect discourse, and it might be a way of getting inside the interior of Anne's mind. But actually, I don't think there's much interior in the mind of this Anne. And although I think there are about 3 scenes, one on the beach, and I don't recall the other 2 at the moment, where she does seem to speak about compassion and love. One scene with Mr. Benwick, and another scene with Mr. Wentworth, who I think is the most miscast Austen hero I have ever seen in my life. I think he is the soppiest hangdog man I have ever seen. I just don't know how he managed to get the part or to play the part in that way without somebody saying, no, go away, we'll get somebody else. So that's, I think, what I've now is giving you a double answer, what I liked and what I didn't like. And I don't know, how do you feel about, did you find any good points?
Well, when I first watched the film, I thought this is the worst Jane Austen adaptation I have ever seen. It's also one of the worst movies I've ever seen, and I didn't find it entertaining. I found it boring, actually, certainly on the first viewing. The second viewing, I think I felt slightly better about it. Like you, I felt Richard E. Grant was wonderfully cast as Sir Walter. I loved the moments when he's, having his face powdered, and he captured Sir Walter beautifully. He wasn't always given very good lines to say, but he captured the essence of Sir Walter extremely well. I also liked Mary Musgrove. I felt she, with her lying on the sofa, and her headaches are always worse than anybody's, and forgetting where her children were. I thought that was a nice little touch at the end. She had no idea where her children were. So I thought she was well done. I felt one of my favourite scenes, and then it suddenly became my least favourite scene, was when they all go to visit Lady Dalrymple and the Honourable Miss Carteret, and they're all sitting there uncomfortably cramped on a sofa trying to drink their tea. And then there comes those moments of buffoonery that you mentioned. Anne, who is a gentlewoman in the novel, slurps her tea and gives that unbelievably dreadful speech about dreaming of an octopus all over her face. And I think, why did they put this into the script? It was a good moment until suddenly they had all that rubbish. And why was she clutching a bunny rabbit throughout some of the things, and drinking wine straight from the bottle? And Anne is such a beloved, ladylike, intelligent, sweet, gracious heroine. And as you say, they turned her into a buffoon. And Jane Austen does buffoons fabulously, but Anne Elliot is not one of them. So for me, there were just, and I agree with you about Captain Wentworth being completely miscast. He was unshaven, miserable. He looked as if he was about to be ill half the time. He was seriously miscast. So that, I think, was a major fault of the film, because those of us who love the novel fall in love with Captain Wentworth, and to see him so miserably and unattractively represented on the screen is, I think, really sad. So while it improved in a tiny way on the second watching, I think I still have to say it is, yes, I do still say it is the worst Jane Austen adaptation I've ever seen. And I'm just really sad that they so wasted that opportunity to make another good adaptation of Persuasion. And I didn't mind the fourth wall so much. I felt, to begin with, I thought they could do something interesting with this, but the dialogue she was given was just so atrocious that just ruined the movie for me.
Well, I think the worst moment was actually the first moment of I almost got married once. And I thought, the precision and care with which Jane Austen selects every word, the precision and care with which my grammar teacher taught me never to use the word "got" if I wanted to be seen as someone who understood the beauty of language in that sense. But Susannah, I think another one of the interesting things, and I think the interest of all adaptations for me now, lies in wondering why they do what they do, why they change what they change, and why they leave intact what they do. I think in this one, in those few scenes I mentioned, they did leave the gentleness of Anne intact, but then that really laughed at Anne in every other scene, because whenever she was slyly winking at the audience, you thought to yourself, this is not the gentle Anne Elliot that I, for example, aspired to be, and which in my own Jane Austen Remedy, which I wrote, became the sort of the climax of the mature heroine who pointed to me the way a woman might want to be, and who certainly, I think, for so many male readers, was the woman they wanted to marry, the sort of woman they wanted to marry. Who on earth would want to marry this particular Anne Elliot? She would really give you a run for your money. But maybe that's the pushback that these people, you see, I think there is so much pushback in some of the adaptations, and it's very hard if you're going to push back against the role of women in Jane Austen's novels, while at the same time you are understanding the beauty of her heroines and what you have to learn from the heroines. There's a sort of a tension there that it's very hard to overcome. And I think with this Persuasion, I was left with something that I read a lot of the responses, some by ordinary readers and some by more skillful readers, and one that really impressed me was one that said that all this Persuasion gave you were a few Jane Austen vibes. What do you think? Do you think she leaves enough vibes? No.
I don't think they're genuine Jane Austen vibes in this particular adaptation, and that's what makes me sad. And while, yes, they were trying to show that it was very difficult for Anne because, the pen is in the hands of the men and women can't travel and they can't move around and they can't make direct approaches to the men. In one of the scenes on the beach when Anne Elliot is talking to Captain Wentworth, they sort of agree to be friends, and she virtually says she's still in love with him. And the whole point of the novel is that Anne can't say that. She's got to wait for him to talk. She's got to pick up his signs at the concert, and the scene with the umbrella and the jealousy of Mr. Elliot. And she's got to wait for all of that. And for me, this movie removed all those things, and Anne is so feminist and feisty and speaking out for women that you lose the whole point of her restrictions and her confinement at Uppercross and in Bath, her dependence on her horrible family, that she can't just, as a girl today would do, send him a text message and say, "Hey Fred, sorry, I made a mistake, let's get back together again." She's unable to do that. And to me, the film, while trying to be feminist and show a more assertive, independent Anne, loses that important message from the novel. One comment that appears quite often in regards to Jane Austen adaptations is that no matter how good or how bad they are, the hope is that they will bring young people to reading the book for the first time. Do you think this adaptation will lead young people to read Persuasion? And if so, having seen the film, what on earth are they going to make of the novel?
Well, I do think it very well might bring them. I have just read, interestingly enough, an article in an English teacher's journal which speaks about giving young people, and they're talking about, I think, children in years 10 and 11, synopsis of books in terms of the negative things that have been said about them. And I suppose you might give them you might present them with the idea of this film and the negative things, and the idea of this very sly, cheeky, audacious, modern heroine, the change with the chaperone Lady Russell, who actually has lovers in Europe once a year.
Goes on
sex tours, all these things. Yes, I think those subjects might read young people to the novels. What they'll do when they get to the novels, I'm not quite sure, but I'm also not sure that the very idea of comparing the novel to the film mightn't be a way, it might perhaps be a way of bringing young people into almost an unexpected understanding of what Jane Austen is really trying to do. I just think that in this one, Susannah, they made so many mistakes in the things they left out. You know, the way they left, I really think you needed to have Mrs. Smith in there somewhere. She was a really important catalyst for showing very special things.
Absolutely.
And I always also think some of the things that happens with adaptations, and it certainly happens with this one, you get all sorts of conflations with bits of Austen's life, bits of other novels. As I said, I really think they're picking up on the sorts of heroines that she wrote about in her juvenilia.
Yes.
I think in that, I think it's in the first volume, the first, Alice and Jack.
Jack and Alice, yes.
There is a talk about taking to the bottle,
getting dead drunk.
and getting drunk being such a one. I think they've tried to do a lot of that.
Yes.
And in a way that becomes, I suppose, a sort of intertextuality that kids are taught about now at school to venerate so much. And I think it certainly does. Those resonances do change the way you interpret things. But, for example, for me, the change in the relationship between William Elliot and Anne is really something to wrestle with. I mean, you just suddenly thought, I'm in another novel now.
Yes.
I've gone back to Sense and Sensibility, and I'm there with Willoughby and all the cads, and here is this gentle, sweet girl sort of confessing that, he's not a bad deal and she might like to have him in her life. It sort of didn't make a lot of sense.
No, it really didn't make any sense. And then, of course, you see him groping and passionately kissing Mrs. Clay in the marketplace in Bath. And you think, okay, well, they've removed Mrs. Smith and they perhaps got to have some way of showing that he is a cad. But yes, it was all too rushed. It was unconvincing. So again, that was a part of the plot that for me just really didn't work. So there were some things, I think there's a lot that's interesting about it. I do know that there are many people who are saying no, they absolutely refuse to watch it because they've heard that it's a dreadful travesty of Jane Austen's novel. But I think it is something that Jane Austen readers should watch, just to remind themselves of how wonderful the book is, and to be made, I think, to think about the challenges of turning a great novel into a movie. And it can be done, but it certainly, in my view, was not done this time with Persuasion. But having said that, Ruth, I know you love the Greer Garson, Laurence Olivier Pride and Prejudice. Is that your favourite movie adaptation, or do you have others that you love?
I am an absolute minority here, but not as much. I mean, yes, that one is my favourite, and I mean, that's just a sign of age and all sorts of other things, and we are allowed our little bit of nostalgia. But I did love Gwyneth Paltrow's Emma, and I know not many people did, but I think of all the scenes I remember that I love. It is the box, it is the Miss Bates, it is that moment when Emma registers the rebuke of Mr. Knight. To me, that just sums up the moral seriousness of everything that Jane Austen really wanted to convey. And I mean, I think, as I said before, there are all sorts of things. I mean, this Persuasion is following the trend. We've got colour diversity, we've got ethnic diversity, we've got gender pushback, we've got all those things. But I suppose what we really haven't got is Anne Elliot, and that's rather sad.
It's very sad not to have that beloved heroine. I'm like you, I'm quite fond of the Gwyneth Paltrow version. I think she was a fabulous Emma. I had problems with Toni Collette as Harriet Smith, and lots of the plot was left out, but I did like Gwyneth Paltrow, and of course Jeremy Northam was gorgeous as Mr. Knightley, maybe too young and too handsome, but who really objects to that? I'm very fond of Emma Thompson's Sense and Sensibility. Yes. I think that was a wonderfully done version. And while she did make a few changes, she gave greater prominence to Margaret, the younger sister. She fleshed out Edward Ferrars a little bit more. You could see why she needed to do it. And so you could follow her reasoning, you could feel her deep love of that novel. But in this new Persuasion, although the papers have said that all the cast and everybody loves the novel of Persuasion, that didn't come through. I thought, how could they do this to a novel that they so love? And you couldn't see the reasons for the changes. And things like the jam over her mouth when she meets up with Wentworth again, and silly scenes where she is turned into a rather ridiculous character. I could not see any reason for doing that. So if you can see the reason for a filmmaker and a scriptwriter making the necessary changes to make that movement from book page to screen, then you can go with it. But for this film, I just couldn't see the rhyme or reason behind it. And I think that's why it left me feeling not only cold, but I think also angry. I felt it was a missed opportunity and that they could have done something so wonderful, and they simply didn't.
Well, I suppose this is my last word, Susannah. I don't feel as strongly as you. I do feel they missed the point, and compared with Emma Thompson, who really got the point, you could see the reason for everything she did. It was a true gloss on the novel itself. I do still feel I was entertained. I did find, apart from Captain Wentworth, I did feel bits of it were entertaining, and the interest it roused in me in trying to understand what it was failing to do was also made it a more interesting watch.
Well, the wonderful thing about Jane Austen is that we never run out of things to discuss. Goodness knows which of the novels will be filmed next. It will be very interesting to wait and see, but I think we can both be very certain that there will be more Jane Austen film adaptations, because it seems that every generation wants a new version of those 6 fabulous Jane Austen novels. Ruth, it's been wonderful talking to you today. Thank you so much for sharing your views on the new Netflix Persuasion.
Thank you. It's always lovely to have a conversation.